In a quiet suburban town, the unfolding of a tragic love affair left two lives shattered in a way no one could have predicted. Sarah Trent, a well-respected high school teacher in her early 40s, had always been admired for her dedication and passion for literature. Her students loved her, and her colleagues saw her as the model of professionalism. But beneath her composed exterior, Sarah was lonely. Her marriage had disintegrated years ago, and her life felt empty, despite her outward success. Then came Alex, a bright 18-year-old senior with a sharp intellect and an aura of youthful energy. He admired Sarah's knowledge and saw in her someone who understood him better than anyone else. What started as innocent discussions after class slowly turned into something more, a deep, dangerous connection. It began with harmless messages, homework related at first, but soon the texts grew longer, more personal. By the time the summer break approached, their conversations had shifted from books to life, from ideas to emotions. Sarah, overwhelmed by her loneliness, ignored the warning signs. She convinced herself that it was just a friendship. Alex, caught in the thrall of his first adult attraction, misread her vulnerability as mutual desire. One night, while grading papers at home, Sarah heard a knock at her door. It was Alex, standing nervously on her porch, claiming he needed help with an upcoming exam. She hesitated for a moment, but let him in, her heart pounding. They sat down to study, but the unspoken tension between them was thick. And then it happened. He kissed her. She knew it was wrong. Every part of her screamed to stop, but she didn't. The kiss spiraled into a full-blown affair that summer. They met in secret, sneaking around in the shadows, driven by passion and the thrill of the forbidden. But soon, Sarah realized what she had done. She was terrified of losing her career, her reputation, and the life she had built. She told Alex that it had to end, but Alex, blinded by youthful intensity, refused to let her go. He threatened to tell everyone if she didn't stay with him. Fear turned to desperation. One hot August evening, Alex showed up unannounced at her house again, his eyes wild with rage after receiving Sarah's final message to end things. The confrontation was fierce, heated words turning into a struggle. In a moment of blind panic, Sarah grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and struck Alex, knocking him to the floor. His body went limp, the life fading from his eyes. Sarah collapsed in shock, realizing what she had done. She called the police, her hands shaking, unable to process the horror of the moment. When the officers arrived, they found her sobbing beside Alex's lifeless body, confessing everything in broken whispers. In the end, Sarah Trent was convicted of manslaughter, and the tragic story of a teacher's affair with her student became the talk of the town. But for those involved, there were no real victors, only the haunting memory of a summer passion that had spiraled into a deadly, irreversible end. The courtroom was packed on the day of Sarah Trent's trial, a media circus surrounding the quiet suburban tragedy. Everyone wanted to know how a respected teacher had fallen so far, how a seemingly perfect life had ended in such horrific violence. Sarah sat at the defense table, a shell of her former self. Gone was the vibrant teacher who had once inspired her students. In her place was a woman haunted by guilt and shame. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of anyone around her. The prosecution painted a damning picture. They described Sarah as a manipulative predator who had used her authority and influence to seduce a vulnerable student, only to murder him when he threatened to expose the truth. The prosecutor emphasized Alex's youth, his potential, and how his life had been tragically cut short by someone who should have protected him. But Sarah's defense attorney offered a different narrative. He spoke of a woman trapped in a spiral of loneliness and fear, someone who had made a terrible mistake, but was not a cold-blooded killer. He described how Alex had grown increasingly obsessive, how he had harassed Sarah, and how, on that fateful night, she had acted in self-defense, fearing for her safety. Witnesses were called. Alex's friends testified to how he had changed in those final weeks, how he'd become erratic, obsessed with Sarah, and how he had confided in them about their secret relationship. But those who knew Sarah, her colleagues and former students, spoke of her character, insisting that what had happened was not the result of malice, but of a woman pushed to the edge. As the days passed, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavier. Sarah's confession had sealed her fate in many eyes, but there was still the question of intent. Was it murder, or had she lashed out in a moment of panic? The evidence of the violent struggle between Sarah and Alex was undeniable. Forensics had confirmed that Alex had been struck once, a fatal blow to the head. But there were signs of a scuffle. Bruises on Sarah's arms, a broken chair, and overturned furniture, which suggested a chaotic struggle rather than a calculated attack. The climax of the trial came when Sarah took the stand. Her voice was trembling as she described the affair and the overwhelming guilt that consumed her. She admitted that she had been wrong to engage in the relationship, that she had crossed a line, but she pleaded with the jury to understand that she had never meant for any of this to happen. Through tears, Sarah recounted the events of that night. Alex had been furious, she said, yelling that he would ruin her life, that he didn't care what happened to either of them anymore. When she tried to calm him, he had grabbed her, shaking her, his face contorted with anger. In the struggle, she had reached for the lamp to defend herself, never intending to kill him. The courtroom was silent as she finished her testimony, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment. Her words hung in the air, leaving the jury to decide whether they believed her story of self-defense or whether they saw her as a killer trying to escape justice. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Sarah Trent would not be charged with murder, but she would serve a significant sentence for taking a life. Her future now is shattered as the community's trust. As she was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom buzzed with whispers, a mixture of sympathy and condemnation. The story of the teacher and her student would remain a dark chapter in the town's history, a cautionary tale of how passion and fear can lead to ruin. Outside, the media frenzy continued, but for Sarah, none of it mattered anymore. Her life, once filled with promise, had become a prison of her own making. Months had passed since the trial, but the aftermath of Sarah Trent's crime continued to ripple through the town. Her sentence, 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10, had divided the community. Some believed she deserved more, that the tragic end of Alex's life demanded harsher justice. Others, particularly those who knew Sarah before the affair, saw her as a victim of her own loneliness, a woman who had made a terrible mistake and paid a heavy price. In the cold isolation of her prison cell, Sarah struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Each day, she replayed the events in her mind, her affair with Alex, the final confrontation, and the moment she took his life. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, but even more than that, she felt the weight of loss. She had lost everything: her career, her freedom, and most of all, the sense of who she had once been. Prison life was a stark contrast to the structured world she once knew. The monotony of the days was broken only by occasional visits from her defense attorney and the rare letters from her sister, the only family member who hadn't completely abandoned her. Sarah spent her time quietly, keeping to herself, too ashamed to seek out the companionship of other inmates. Her life was now defined by routine, her mind a constant battlefield between regret and the faintest flicker of hope for redemption. But even as Sarah grappled with her new reality, the world outside continued to change. Alex's parents, devastated by the loss of their only child, had become vocal advocates for stricter laws regarding teacher-student relationships, turning their grief into a cause. They appeared on talk shows, spoke at schools, and lobbied for legislative change. For them, Sarah's punishment would never be enough, but they channeled their pain into trying to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Meanwhile, whispers about the affair still circulated in town. Former students who had once adored Sarah now distanced themselves, horrified by the details that had emerged. Parents, too, were wary, questioning how a teacher could cross such a boundary. And yet, there were some who still remembered her for the educator she had once been, before everything fell apart. They spoke of her with sadness, not condemnation, understanding that no one had emerged from the situation unscathed. As time wore on, Sarah began attending therapy sessions offered in the prison. It was there that she met Dr. Miller, a psychologist who specialized in helping inmates cope with guilt and trauma. At first, Sarah was resistant, unwilling to open up, but Dr. Miller was patient, slowly breaking through the walls Sarah had built around herself. In one particularly difficult session, Sarah finally admitted aloud what had haunted her the most. "I should have ended it the moment it started. I should have stopped him when I saw where it was going. But I didn't. And now, I've destroyed both our lives." Dr. Miller's response was calm but firm. "You can't change the past, Sarah, but you can understand it. And you can decide who you want to be moving forward. That's all you have now, how you live the rest of your life." The words stuck with Sarah. Though she could never undo the damage she had caused, she realized that her life didn't have to be defined solely by that one terrible night. She began writing letters, not to Alex's family, not yet, but to herself. In these letters, she chronicled her journey, her regrets, and her hopes for the future. It was a small step, but it gave her a sense of purpose in a world where she had so little control. One day, a letter arrived for Sarah, one that she never expected. It was from Alex's mother. The words were simple, but they cut deep. "I don't forgive you, and I may never. But I need to know why. Why did you do it? Why didn't you stop it before it went this far?" Sarah stared at the letter for hours, unsure how to respond. She knew there was no answer that would ease a grieving mother's pain, no explanation that could justify the choices she had made. But something in her told her that she needed to try, that this might be the only way to truly begin atoning for what she had done. She picked up a pen and started to write. "Dear Mrs. Morgan, there is no excuse for what I did. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know the truth." As Sarah wrote, the weight of the past seemed to shift, if only slightly. It wasn't absolution, but it was a step toward confronting the consequences of her actions in a way she had avoided for too long. For the first time in months, Sarah felt that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live with the guilt that had consumed her. Her journey was far from over, but with each passing day, she was learning to confront her demons, one painful memory at a time. Years passed, and the story of Sarah Trent and Alex Morgan faded from the headlines. But the scars it left behind remained etched in the hearts of those closest to the tragedy. Sarah, now deep into her prison sentence, had become a shadow of the vibrant teacher she once was. Yet, prison life had forced her into a kind of reckoning. Through therapy and reflection, she had gradually come to terms with her actions. She knew she could never undo the damage, but she was learning to live with it, piece by painful piece. The letters to Alex's mother, Mrs. Morgan, had continued sporadically. At first, they were met with silence, but over time, Mrs. Morgan began to respond. Her letters were short, often filled with anger and sorrow, but they kept coming. Through this painful correspondence, both women began to confront the gaping wound left by Alex's death, though neither had healed entirely. One day, Sarah received an unexpected letter. Her first parole hearing was set for the following year. The news was met with mixed emotions. Part of her longed to be free, to leave the walls of her confinement behind, but another part of her dreaded facing the outside world, knowing the stigma that would follow her. What life awaited her on the other side? Could she even call it a life? As the parole hearing approached, Sarah was visited by her sister Emily for the first time in years. The two had grown distant after Sarah's arrest, but Emily had always quietly supported her, even when others in the family had turned away. Sitting across from each other in the visitation room, there was a silence that stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. "You look better than I thought you would," Emily finally said, her voice tentative. "I've had a lot of time to think," Sarah replied, her voice steady but hollow. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think you'll get parole? Do you want it?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. I'm not the same person I was before, but out there, I'm not sure if there's anything left for me." Emily looked at her sister with a mix of sympathy and sadness. "You have to try. You can't live the rest of your life trapped by this. You made a mistake, a terrible one, but that doesn't mean you can't try to build something new. If not for yourself, then maybe for the people you hurt." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Sarah. She had been punishing herself for so long, but maybe, just maybe, there was a possibility for some kind of redemption. Not for forgiveness, but for a new beginning. At the parole hearing, Sarah faced a panel of officials, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. She didn't make excuses. She didn't ask for pity. She simply told the truth. "I've spent the last years of my life thinking about what I did, about Alex, about his family, and the consequences of my actions. I know that I can never bring him back, and I can never erase the pain I've caused. But I've tried to understand it, and I've tried to change. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope for a chance to prove that I can be better, that I can make something of the life I still have." The room was silent when she finished. The panel members conferred quietly among themselves before delivering their decision. Sarah Trent was granted parole. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some believed she had paid her debt to society, while others thought she deserved to stay behind bars for the rest of her life. But for Sarah, it was not about public opinion. It was about what came next, what she would do with the second chance she had been given. Upon her release, Sarah returned to the outside world as a stranger to herself. The town had changed, and so had she. The whispers followed her, but Sarah had expected that. She found a small, modest apartment in a neighboring town and took on quiet, unassuming work. Her days were filled with routine, but in that simplicity, she found a strange peace. One day, a letter arrived, addressed from Mrs. Morgan. Sarah hesitated before opening it, bracing herself for the familiar rush of guilt and sorrow. But this time, the tone was different. It was still filled with pain, but there was also something else. Closure. "I don't think I'll ever forgive you, Sarah," Mrs. Morgan had written. "But I can see that you've tried to make amends, even in your own way. I can't let go of the anger yet, but I wanted you to know that I understand you didn't mean for any of this to happen, that you're human, and that humans make mistakes. I won't ever forget what you did, but I'm trying to move on. I hope you are too." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she folded the letter. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close to acceptance, something that allowed both of them to start healing. In the quiet of her apartment, Sarah looked out the window at the world moving on around her. Life was never going to be easy, and the weight of her past would always be with her. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, the faintest possibility that there could still be something left for her in this life. She had been broken, yes, but maybe now she could begin to rebuild. And with that, Sarah Trent took her first tentative steps into her new life, knowing that redemption, like forgiveness, was a journey, a slow, painful journey, but one that was worth taking.